I guess just before I get started, and I hope the sun won't be too much, I guess just a few words about the paper, which is, I would call it a related side project to the book that I'm currently working on, which is titled Avant-Garde with an Accent. And it's a book that examines the artistic production of Hungarian communist artists who lived in exile around Europe and then the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1956. So just as here in this paper, sort of linguistic phenomena such as translations, mistranslations, untranslatables, mispronunciations, or even accents are really at the center of my study. And I think what I'm really interested in is sort of bridging art history, the field which is now I think is increasingly known as linguistic ideology and post-colonial theory, to sort of think about an art historical methodology that could actually account for questions around the politics of language that I think are, in my view at least, I think they are always embedded in artistic production, but they just really become sort of visible and tangible as soon as we start talking about migrant artists. So that is just heads up that there will be a lot of weird linguistic stuff in this paper, and I should say there will be probably less Rákosi and more language, but that's maybe for the better. Who knows? Okay. So let me start here with this propaganda poster from 1943. Stenciled in three colors, black, soft gray, and deep red, it shows a monumental Soviet woman on the left, stationed on top of a red podium, while fearlessly pointing at three men in chains: Hitler, Göring, and Goebbels. The woman is not just a symbol of the Soviet judicial system. She's, in fact, the judge of history who brings justice to the Soviet people with the help of the Soviet people. To quote the short poem, which is stenciled in Russian under the image on the left side, "The hour will come when judgment will be passed on a band of bloody monsters. Her people will bring them in chains for the righteous judgment." And apologies for the not very elegant translation. It's my translation from the Russian, so I'm not sure I'm getting the rhymes, but it actually kind of rhymes in a really fun way. It might be tempting to quickly pass our own judgment on this poster and dismiss it as yet another example of the myriad cliché anti-fascist propaganda posters that were designed, printed, and distributed in the Soviet Union and, in fact, all around the world after June 1941, when the Second World War and the threat of Nazism at last reached the Soviet Union. So what may stand out for viewers today is its purposefully simple aesthetic design with its blank background and with the use of three basic colors only. And I guess we should also say a word about the very standard caricature tropes that we see here for depicting the Nazi leaders. Yet, here comes the fun part, I would like to derail our aesthetic judgments for a second and propose that it is, in fact, a quite extraordinary poster, an example of the transnational and experimental collaboration that was so unique to the Soviet Union, even at the height of Stalinism in the early 1940s. It is a transnational experiment which was executed in Soviet Central Asia, in Soviet Kyrgyzia, which involved, at the very least, three creative professionals and at least three languages. So, as we've seen, there is the short rhyming poem in Russian by the Soviet-Russian poet Yakova Pushkin. There's a poem of equal length and I would say strengths in Kyrgyz by the Soviet Kyrgyz poet Ali Tokombayev. And I should note that to this day, Tokombayev is one of the national poet heroes of Kyrgyzstan. And then we have the visual language of a Soviet internationalist, a communist political migrant from Eastern Europe, or, as I like to say, an official Soviet foreigner with actually legal documents and even Soviet citizenship at this point, and that is the Hungarian-born woman, Jolán Szilágyi. So the questions I would like to pose today are, so how did such a multilingual and transnational experiment come to be in Soviet Central Asia in the early 1940s? How could a migrant artist such as Szilágyi, who, I should say, did not speak any Kyrgyz, and who had great difficulties even with the Russian language, so how could she participate in such a collaboration? And I think I really would like to sort of take these questions seriously and really think about how did her internationalist language, a visual language that I still consider just as complicated as any of the verbal languages, come to be in Soviet Central Asia. So what I will try to do today is I will try to use two examples that I think can help us sort of think through the linguistic politics of art making and what it means to make art as a migrant in Soviet Central Asia. And I hope what these two examples will show us is really that there is just absolutely nothing obvious and nothing universal about this internationalist visual language. So the first example that we will see is one of Szilágyi's poster designs from Frunze, as it was called at the time, that was, as I argue, literally untranslatable as an image. And the second example I would like to show is I want to take a look at her surviving correspondence from her time in Frunze, which actually shows how she was participating in the political network of the Hungarian Communist Party in the Soviet Union, which was centered around its leader, Mátyás Rákosi. And she was doing so to try to get access to political materials in her mother tongue. Because the point is, if you want to make political caricature, you kind of have to understand what's going on around you, right? If you don't speak the languages, you have no way of engaging in this sort of visual practice. So hopefully towards the end, we'll also get to Rákosi and sort of think about these critical collaborations and how these collaborations made artistic production possible for a European migrant in Central Asia. So overall, I would kind of add that one of my goals today is to consider the major cities of Soviet Central Asia among the cosmopolitan metropolises that were, even if only temporarily, home to significant Central and Eastern European diasporas in the first half of the 20th century. So I'm kind of moving away from Berlin and Paris and London and other places and really go to Central Asia. And I think it's especially true in the early 1940s. So today it's mostly about 1941, 1944, when the western part of the Soviet Union, including not only what was the then recently redesigned Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, but also places like Moscow or what was then Leningrad. So these were the territories of the Soviet Union that were evacuated to Soviet Central Asia. So there is just a huge influx of people going to Central Asia in these years. So among the cities that I would like to show today, I will primarily talk about Frunze. So sorry, the name tags it wasn't very easy to add 3 names to kind of a smaller territory on this map, but so Frunze, which is today Bishkek, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, which since 1936 was the capital of the Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic, which was one of the latest national republics that was created within the Soviet Union under Stalin. But one could also talk about Tashkent, today the capital of Uzbekistan, which from 1930 was the capital of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, or Alma-Ata, or today Almaty, the largest city of Kazakhstan, which between 1936 and 1991 was the capital of the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic. And I guess this is the point where I should just make a brief comment or a note about the sort of historical background of colonialism here. So just very briefly, these Central Asian republics, as they came to be known, became part of the Russian Empire in like the late 19th century, practically, and when the Soviets take power, or the Bolsheviks took power, then they became part of the new Bolshevik Empire, and it was particularly under Stalin that, for the first time, these specifically national republics were created. So the 1930s is the time when we are seeing a sort of a Soviet-style nation building in this part of the Soviet Union. And just a final note before I move on. So what you are seeing here is actually a map that I photographed in Bishkek at the train station in the summer of 2022. And of course, it's a Soviet-era map, right? It's the map of the Soviet Union. But I think for me, just the very fact that this map is still like at the center of the train station is in Bishkek just really speaks to the sort of lingering colonial histories that I guess we see a lot of that today too. So I guess my one more note I would like to make is that my paper is, of course, also very much interested or related to my interest in remapping Central and Eastern Europe in sort of transnational and global dialogues. So, for instance, in a dialogue with Central Asia, a dialogue that I believe really forces us to sort of leave behind the usual hierarchies of power that are historically embedded in relationship between the West or between the West and Central and Eastern Europe. And I think these are sort of transnational and global dialogues that really sort of give us opportunities to create new kinds of narrative that are in no way sort of innocent in any way, but I think they give us a chance to really sort of try to see different patterns of hierarchies and power dynamics. So I've been really sort of interested in that. So to be able to tell the story of Jolán Szilágyi in Central Asia, I would like to just very briefly introduce the artist. And so I guess some of the key points is that she was born in 1895 in a city that she called Székelyudvarhely, which is today Odorheiu Secuiesc in Romania. Just going back to our conversation, how to even address the names of cities. But she was a young woman in her mid-20s when she signed up for Bolshevism during the 1919 Hungarian Bolshevik Republic. And on the right, you see one of the very few propaganda posters that she made as a young artist in 1919. And as a result of her commitment to Bolshevism, she spent the next 30 years of her life in exile. And so you see here this photograph of her as a young exile, most likely in Vienna. She was among, I would say she was the very first Hungarian artist who arrived in Moscow in 1920. She was a special guest of the Comintern, the Communist International, the international organization of communist parties. And she was sent to Berlin in 1921 by the Comintern to do some illegal propaganda work. You see on the right here, you see one of her first work in Berlin as she arrived, which is her, I think in my reading, a very constructivist cover design for John Reed's 10 Days That Shook the World. She would spend the next more than a decade in Berlin doing political caricature, and so this is the part of the story that we have already touched on yesterday. So Professor Zwickel showed us yesterday her caricature about a swastika, which functions as a decorative furniture, which was actually part of the Magyar Modern exhibition in Berlin recently. And here I'm showing you how it was actually published in one of the communist papers, the Tribunal, in 1931. So the Tribunal was one of the many communist papers that she was working for while she was in Berlin until 1933, when she relocated to Moscow. And I have to admit that this is the part of the story where we just still have a lot of work to do, because we just don't really know what she did when she arrived in Moscow. As far as I understand, she worked for German and Hungarian language communist papers such as the Deutsche Zentralzeitung or Zwei Welten and Sarló és Kalapács. But here I'm just showing you a couple of works that I've managed to find that are today in public collections. But what we do know is that with the Soviet Union entering the Second World War, in November 1941, she was among the approximately 200 foreigners who arrived in Frunze, Soviet Kyrgyzia, from Moscow with a special train that was arranged by the International Red Aid, known as MOPR, or the Internationale Rote Hilfe, which was one of the sort of social welfare organizations of the Comintern. So she was evacuated from Moscow along with political migrants from Austria, Czechoslovakia, Germany, Hungary, and Italy, according to documents that are preserved today in the Central State Archive of the Kyrgyz Republic in Bishkek. And so here I'm just showing you one of the documents that I had a chance to see in Bishkek in 2022, and this is also a picture of the train station. You can still see the screen, can you? Yeah? Okay. Cool. Upon arrival in Frunze, the local MOP organization immediately assigned her to Poltavka, a small village some 50 kilometers to the west of the capital city Frunze, to a kolkhoz where she was supposed to live and work along with locals and the other international newcomers. And here you can see my picture that I took on a beautiful August day in 2022. But what is probably clear from this picture is that it was nothing. I mean, it was anything but a metropolis, right? I mean, it's literally a tiny, tiny village in the middle of the countryside of back then Soviet Kyrgyzia. And on top, Szilágyi arrived there for a long and tough winter in 1941 without basics such as a blanket. So like all the others, as we know from her surviving correspondence, they slept on the floor in unheated rooms, and again without even blankets or warm stuff. What was even worse, according to her letters, is that she could not find any work as an artist. I mean, again, she was sent to a kolkhoz. So she tried to decorate the local wallpaper, and she tried to send some political caricatures to the local Soviet newspaper, which was the Russian language Sovietskaya Kyrgyzia, so Soviet Kyrgyzia. But it was simply not enough to make a basic living. And I should add here that with all my best efforts, I have so far managed to find 2 of her caricatures that were published in Sovietskaya Kyrgyzia. So I think we can kind of imagine why she could not make a living as an artist from 2 caricatures. But things got much better for her in the spring of 1942, when she managed to move to Frunze and join the Union of Kyrgyz Artists, which offered her regular meals and food tickets, and supposedly allowed her to participate in the union's exhibitions. Nevertheless, despite branding herself constantly as an anti-fascist caricaturist who for more than a decade worked with John Hartfield in Berlin, the evacuation to Kyrgyzia posed some real obstacles to her political art making. As Szilágyi repeatedly complained to the head of the Hungarian section of the Comintern, Mátyás Rákosi, she, quote, was forced to relative muteness in Kyrgyzia, end quote, having close to no opportunities and means to use the expertise she had gained in visual satire in Germany. And so here you can see one of these quite desperate letters that she sent to Rákosi in 1943. So the question is, right, why is that? Right? Why is an artist who has all the credentials cannot participate in this very important political work in Kyrgyzia? And I think the answer really has nothing to do with any kind of like political or aesthetic clash. I think it really comes down to language. or at least I would like to argue that her forced muteness really resulted from this linguistic condition of her multiple exiles, right? From the fact that she could not speak Kyrgyz, as I mentioned, but she even had difficulties with the Russian language, and an especially telling document about her sort of Russian linguistic skills is actually a typical characteristica that was written about her in Kyrgyzia by the head of the Kyrgyz Union of Artists, who went on and on about how excited she is to participate in all the political work, yet, quote, she is somewhat hindered in her work by insufficient knowledge of the Russian language, end quote. So clearly she had difficulties communicating. And I wanted to use this design for a poster as an example of her difficulties with the Russian and Kyrgyz languages. So what we see here is Hitler with a huge axe cutting a tree trunk, right? So for a Hungarian speaker like myself, of course, the sort of Hungarian idiom that immediately comes to mind is nagy fába vágta a fejszéjét, or nehéz fába vágta a fejszéjét, which is impossible to translate, so maybe the sort of closest we get is to try to sort of bite off more chunks than you can take. But so if we try to literally translate it, it literally means to wedge your axe in a big or a heavy tree, which in Hungarian means, right, that someone is trying to do something that is definitely going to fail because it's just something beyond one's capacities. And so I just want to use this example here as like how her caricature was untranslatable, right? I mean, it's a political caricature that draws on this Hungarian idiom that you just cannot translate to Russian or to Kyrgyz, right? So it's an example of how her thinking with her Hungarian mindset sort of ends up in a linguistic vacuum in Soviet Kyrgyzia. And I would say one could even read this, if one does not understand the Hungarian idiom behind it, one could even say that it's a counter-revolutionary image, right? I mean, we are seeing the Soviet Union as a tree trunk that is being cut down by Hitler. So it's just an example of how language is so deeply embedded in political art making. And I think my time is over, yes. So I guess I'm just, okay, so unfortunately we did not get much to Mátyás Rákosi, who really sort of helped her not only to get warm clothing and jobs, but actually who provided her with Hungarian language political materials, because as Szilágyi kept begging him, she could not work without having these political materials to know what to draw. I guess I will end there, and with another example of a poster design that has survived, that she tried to do in Kyrgyzia, and maybe just leave us with this idea how much political caricature and in fact the language of socialist realism is just never easily legible. Even if it's a political cliche, it really is built on and embedded in language that then becomes really sort of visible and tangible when we talk about migrants. Thank you so much.